am I saying hello to?
I can't see everybody who's, I know Elon Adler's here, I know Ken is here, our speaker's here. I
Okay,
think Sarah Turlover's here.
okay, we're ready.
Yeah.
Moving right along.
Let me introduce Zachary so we can start our discussion. So the Israel Action Committee has started a discussion about what value Israel has to us as progressive Jews in the current world. And I was fortunate to be introduced to Zachary Schaffer, who really is a very talented facilitator in discussions on these topics. He is not only the executive director of the Council of Young Jewish Professionals, he's also the president of an organization called Friends of Roots, which is an organization that works with Palestinians and Israelis in the West Bank. And beyond that, he is also a very skilled facilitator about discussions on Israel and Israel's importance in the world today. So with that, I will turn it over to Zachary to lead the discussion.
All right. Thank you so much, Jerry. It's been great getting to know you and learning a little bit more about the synagogue community. My name is Zach Schaffer. There is not a very long presentation. The hope is I can spark some interest, some conversation, and we can have a dialogue for most of the time that we're here together. So I will introduce a little of my background so you know who I am, what I believe, what some of my experiences are, and what my biases are. I'll share one idea that I want to share with you, which may be a 10 or 15 minute offering. And then I'd love to jump into a conversation, hear your questions, your rebuttals, your criticisms, your ideas, your dreams, and we can see where the conversation takes us. My name is Zach Schaffer. I'm 28 years old. I live in Bed-Stuy, Brooklyn. I identify, as you know, as a Zionist, and that's what we're here to talk about. And I also identify as a progressive. And I've dedicated a lot of my life to progressive work and progressive activism. And I've also dedicated a lot of my life to depolarization, to civil discourse, de-radicalization, bringing people together across extreme differences. And I do this work in all kinds of ways. I'm the president of an organization that brings Israelis and Palestinians, many of whom are formerly violent, people living in the West Bank, in Judea and Samaria, in Palestine, choose your language, where there's the most bitterness, the most anger, the most injustice, the most religious fervor, and the most violence. And we bring together the extremes, the ideologues, the fanatics to do nonviolent coexistence work and to go through nonviolent transformation. I've had opportunities to work with radicals at home. I've had conversations with white supremacists and conspiracy theorists and avowed racists to try to have conversations to understand how we can understand each other across these gaps. And I'm also the founder of an organization called Project Shema, which is an organization that works to train the Jewish community to have conversations about anti-Semitism, Jewish identity, and Israel with folks on the progressive left. And this is an organization that was built out of experiences I and others have had as a progressive activist in the streets, dealing with anti-Semitism, dealing with anti-Zionism, and trying to create space again for those conversations. So, for example, after George Floyd's murder, I spent a lot of time in New York City helping to organize protests in Brooklyn. I was very fortunate to be a part of protests that included thousands and even more than 10,000 folks. I was very fortunate to be able to offer my home as an organizing center for a lot of the protest movements that were going on in Brooklyn. And I was fortunate to have a role that put me in a place where I could have some influence and make some decisions and be there with our Black brothers and sisters who are leading this movement. And of course, I dealt with many challenges and I've tested many messages to figure out how I can help my progressive friends to understand anti-Semitism, to understand Zionism, to carve out a space for me as a progressive, a Zionist, a Jew in a movement that has often been considered toxic to some of those identity markers. So I've lived and breathed a lot of this work, and that's the context that I'm bringing here to you today, the experiences that I've had that have brought me here. And I've also done a lot of research and a lot of studying on Zionism. I first went to Israel when I was 16 years old. I met with the organizer of Operation Moses and Operation Solomon, right? Two operations that saved more than 10,000 Jews in Ethiopia who otherwise would have perished. Jews that no one else in the world wanted to save. And what did Israel do? What did the Jewish state do? Absolutely everything, right? They removed seats from commuter planes. They launched a 24-hour overnight operation to airlift thousands of people out, breaking the records for the number of folks who've been on a plane. People gave birth on them and they bring them to Israel, this lost tribe, this lost community of Jews that otherwise would not have been helped. And I met the organizer of this movement, the guy who was on the last plane out of Ethiopia. And I remember the shivers and the goosebumps as I realized Israel's the insurance policy of the Jewish people. Israel is there. God forbid, Has v'shalom, we ever have to cash it in. It is the insurance policy of the Jewish people. It is our last guarantee, our haven behind walls. It is the only place when push comes to shove that we know we have, that we know we belong in, and that we know will save us. And that was my first relationship with Israel, with Zionism. I come from a family that is aware of losing 11 family members in the Holocaust. Who knows how many other names have disappeared? And realizing that Israel played this role, I decided at 16 I needed to be a Zionist. I decided I needed to pay into this insurance policy. And whether or not I ever needed it, because I feel safe, I feel secure, I feel rather comfortable in America, I know other Jews need it elsewhere. I knew it's possible that American Jews could need it here. But it was in my lifetime that this happened in Ethiopia, right? It was in my grandmother's lifetime that this happened to my great uncles and great aunts and cousins from long ago, and it could happen again. And I got into college and I was doing a lot of progressive activism and I was getting very involved and I was a Hillel president and I was doing all this work. And I started to get challenged about what Zionism was, about what Israel was, about what was happening to Palestinians. And I started to realize I didn't like my narrative around Zionism, the idea that Israel was just this refuge, just this place behind walls, just this insurance policy. Because, excuse my language, but there's nothing sexy or seductive about an insurance policy, right? We have them because we need them and we don't like to think about them and we don't like to talk about them. We have them because we need them, right? We don't have them because we love them, right? Because they inspire us, because they change us in a fundamental way. And I didn't want Israel to just be a place I could escape to. I wanted to understand a greater meaning to Israel. So I started to try to learn about Zionism. And I read and I studied, and you'll see the books behind me are examples of that. And I want to tell you a little bit about what that journey looked like and where I ended up. And we're going to look at how that can also help us to have some different conversations around Israel. But one of the things that I realized is that there are two stories of Zionism that we tell in the Jewish community. And I found that there are different parts of the Jewish community that really emphasize one over the other. And the two chapters that I want to share are what I call Zionism the dream and Zionism the reality, or Israel the reality. Zionism the dream is an articulation of the original aspirations of the Jewish state. It's grounded in Zionist ideology, but it's also grounded in Jewish civilization. And I believe it's here where we can create conversation across divides in our community. And then we have a conversation about Zionism, the reality, which is where we can analyze Israel today against our shared understanding of the ideological, the moral, the aspirational background for its existence. And I think this is a way that we can begin to address some of the schisms in the Jewish community and have a more responsible exchange among ourselves and even between the diaspora and Israel. So when I started to look into Zionism, I related to it in a different way, not just as a refuge behind walls, but I started to see Zionism as Jacob Klatskin did, as an aspiration toward morality and beauty, in his own words. I saw Zionism as never complete because it's always aspirational. And I always like to ground my conversations about Israel in the story of Israel's birth. in the story of Zionism that I see, which is its idealism, its beauty, and even its flaws. So what is that? Zionism sought to reclaim the character of a people. It sought to transform our condition, to return us to our homeland, to build a compassionate, a magnanimous, and a moral nation. It's nothing less than a movement to transform the condition of an oppressed group of people and help them to achieve a total rejuvenation of mind, of body, of spirit, of language, of welfare. And I believe it was revolutionary and radical, like all forms of restorative justice are. It stands as proof that victimhood is not destiny, that any people can travel from victimhood and tragedy to triumph. Right? In the words of Solomon Schechter, Zionism is a declaration of Jewish independence from all kinds of slavery, whether material or moral. And I share all of this to say that Zionism is not just a movement to liberate a land, but it was a movement to liberate a people, not just to create a Jewish state, but a Jewish society grounded in Jewish values and Jewish aspirations. And here I'm typically able to get some broad understanding and broad agreement even around what the goal of Israel is. And I never try to convince anyone whether or not Israel has lived up to its dream. I want to instead create some agreement around how early Zionists understood themselves and the ultimate, if not idealistic, goals that they had for the Jewish state. Right? What they sought to create and accomplish with Zionism and with the restoration of Jewish sovereignty in some part of our homeland. And this shared background, again, I've been able to get to that point with friends who identify even as non-Zionist, as post-Zionist, as anti-Zionist. I've done this work and had these conversations with folks in organizations like If Not Now and Jewish Voice for Peace, a non-Zionist and an anti-Zionist organization respectively. And we're able to get into that conversation. And I'm clear that the nation of Israel is in constant conflict between what it is and what it aspires to be, that a dream will always differ with reality. As Amos Oz wrote, the real world inevitably clashes with the imagined one. And the only way to keep a dream intact, Amos Oz writes, is to never try to fulfill it. And of course, we look at Israel today and it is a dream fulfilled. But Israel is also flawed and imperfect, precisely because it is a dream come true. It is a dream fulfilled and it is a dream unfulfilled. And now by critiquing Israel in the context of this dream, of this aspiration, we can critique Israel not to harm, but to uplift, not out of hate for what it is, but out of love for what we believe it seeks to be and could become. And this is a framework that I use very effectively to depoliticize conversations in the Jewish community about Israel and about Zionism, to start a conversation not with Israel's current conditions or politics, but with the hopes of the dreamers before the current balagan, before this current mess. And again, it's a conversation that most people of goodwill can carry on, right? Understanding the historic need, aspirations, and nature of Zionism. And what I often find is, while we can measure Israel's aspirational potential against its current condition, it's not a conversation we're having, because I've seen that there are people who identify as non or anti-Zionist or perhaps progressive who only relate to Israel, the reality. And of course, there are many realities of Israel today, but there is a reality of Israel that is difficult. And it is one that I have seen all too well firsthand. I've spent a lot of time in Area A, in the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, in Palestine. I've spent time with Palestinians in Ramallah and Bethlehem and Beit Sahor. I've spent time in Jenin. I spent time in Nablus. I've spent time in Rawabi. I've been to the refugee camps. I've walked through the checkpoints. I've heard the stories and seen the pain. There is a conflict and a presence of injustice, of hatred, of bitterness, of violence that is happening on the ground, right? There is an occupation happening on the ground. And many people, when they see Israel, they reduce it to that. Jews and non-Jews alike, they only understand one version of Israel, the reality, and they have no context for Zionism, the dream. And what they actually mean when they say they're anti-Zionist, often I find, is they're anti-Zionism, the reality, or Israel, the reality. They're not anti-Zionism, the dream, which is to say, they want to see an end to the occupation. They want to see an end to suffering and injustice. They may want to see a Palestinian state. They may disagree with the Israeli government, Israeli politics, Israeli policy, or many actions of the Israeli Defense Force. But they're not saying, I don't think the Jewish people should have self-determination. They're saying it shouldn't look like this. And I think one of the things that we can do with this framework of the reality and of the dream is to try to match those conversations together. Because I also find I have many friends who describe themselves as Zionist, as Jewish, maybe as right-wing, who only focus on Zionism, the dream, and ignore some of the reality of what's happening today. And they see Zionism as our liberation movement and as our civil rights movement and as an attempt to take a people who've been dealt the lousiest deck of cards in the history of the world and to give them a seat at the table of nations, to redeem and liberate them and emancipate them. And that is, of course, what Zionism seeks to do and has done in many ways. But I find we often overemphasize and focus on one of those without giving attention to the other. And I think each of us needs to ask ourselves, am I reflexively defending Israel and thinking about defending Israel because I'm so wed to the dream that I have trouble opening myself up to some of the reality? Or am I so focused on some of the reality that I see that I'm forgetting the dream, what Israel and Zionism stands for, what it could become, and how that may even help me to better Israel today and to change the status quo that I'm critiquing? And by having that kind of conversation, I personally have found very effectively, I'm able to have these kinds of dialogues about Israel-Palestine, about the conflict, about anti-Zionism, about how anti-Semitism gets enveloped into this movement in really meaningful ways. So with that, I've spoken for about 15 minutes. I want to open the floor for questions, for comments, for conversation. We can continue down any of the route that I just shared. We can also talk about anything else. I gave a little bit of my background so you would have some context about the kind of conversation I might be able to have, the kind of experiences that I may be able to speak to. And I will say as well that I work professionally as a facilitator and a mediator in conflict spaces. So there's no question that's too hard. There's no criticism that will offend me. I really hope that this can be a space for you to really share whatever is on your mind. And I will do my best to answer your question and to share the blind spots or the biases that I may be having while I answer that question. So let me pause and see if there's anyone in the room who wants to engage.
Go ahead, Lee.
Oh, my name is Lee Saldinger. I liked you immediately because you said you were from New York, and I'm a New Yorker and will always be. I'm familiar with the area. If you were to comment on which of the ultra-Orthodox or the Orthodox or the Reform, which of them are more receptive to working with you in what you do in Israel? I don't know if that's a clear question, but
Yeah.
I'd like to know what your comments are and maybe what are the percentages of each of those sects are in Israel, and you're trying to reach out to them, I'm sure.
Yeah. So the organization that I'm president of is called Roots Shorashim in Hebrew, Judor in Arabic. And as I said, it's based in the West Bank. So what that means is we're one of the few, if only, reconciliation and people-to-people work organizations in Israel-Palestine that is explicitly working with settlers. We work over the Green Line, in the Jordan Valley, in the Gush Etzion block, right? We work in that area, which is to say the Jews we are working with are settlers, are living in settlements. The Palestinians we are working with are not Arab Israelis or Palestinian citizens of Israel, right? They are citizens of Palestine, lacking a passport, lacking a citizenship identity in that sense, many of whom may live in refugee camps and may have been moved around, you know, in their family history in 48. So the folks that we're actually directly engaging with are what you might expect to be a settler demographic, right? Folks who are the Jews we're working with are predominantly religious, of course, Zionist, both religious and ideologically Zionist. They are living on land that they believe our ancestors walked on land that they believe was written about in the Torah that God gave us. And they're on that land because they believe it's ours. God gave it to us. It's ours. And they're there for biblical and moral and political and ideological reasons. And the Palestinians we're working with are, of course, some of the more radical Palestinians, right, than like your Arab Israeli citizen of Jerusalem, perhaps, right? Palestinians who might be living as refugees in a refugee camp even. So we're working with that sort of demographic of Jews. It's obviously very different than most peace work. Like most of the peace work happening in Israel is what I like derisively and jokingly call lefties in Tel Aviv, right? These are folks who are like voting for Meretz, who identify, would love Andrea Ocasio-Cortez and Bernie Sanders, like your typical lefties who go to Rabin Square for peace rallies, are sending their kids to Yad B'Yad schools to learn Arabic. And I don't want to say that that isn't meaningful and important, because that is. But we're not working with those lefties. We're not working with secular folks. We're working with religious Jews who are voting for right-wing parties often, who are voting for religious parties perhaps, and are coming from that kind of perspective. And of course, that's the hardest demographic to reach. And there is a critical mass of those folks doing this work, and it is called people-to-people work for a reason. It is one religious Zionist Orthodox Jew living in Efrat or, Alon Shvut saying to his neighbor, I want you to go to this. I want you to show up to this meeting I'm having with Palestinians. And the neighbor saying, Palestinians are terrorists. That's dangerous. I can't risk my life. I don't want to be near them. That's not safe. You're crazy. Nothing will come from this. And him saying, please give it one chance. Just trust me. And he shows up and he comes to this meeting and says, I'll come back once more because this is crazy and I want to understand it, right? And it builds and it builds. And that's how that growth happens. In the States, we probably get most of our support from reform and conservative movements. We haven't been in a lot of Orthodox synagogues. We haven't been in a lot of the Orthodox community in America. While we are working with settlers, we're still working with Palestinians. And we use language that is very cognizant of the situation on the ground, the injustices that Palestinians face, and the language that we use, the people that we elevate, the experiences that they've had are not always something that much of the Orthodox community in America has, reflexively invited into their spaces.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Ruthie.
Okay, you talk about Shoresh. I'm sure you're familiar with the play South Pacific, and there's a song that says you've got to be taught to be afraid of people whose skin is a different shade, etc. If you're going to the Shoresh, are you going to schools? This is where the roots are. You're taught this. You're taught it at home. Children are much more malleable, and the roots of all of this begin somewhere. Let's go to the roots. Are you doing that? Or how do you do that? I don't mean it as a challenge. How are you doing that?
So we work across generations. We have everything from we have youth groups and summer camps, through young adult groups, young professional groups, adult groups, women's groups, interfaith, Jewish Christian and Jewish Muslim tech study groups, nonviolence groups who are coming together to train and gain a capacity for nonviolent discourse and organizing. So there are many ways in which we're engaging people, and it's across the generational spectrum. Roots also does a lot of speaking with Mechinot, the pre-military academies. So many folks who are joining the army will join this, sort of pre-military academy for a year, Jewish learning or otherwise, before they join the army. And we speak to thousands of young Israelis who are 18, who are about to join the army, and give them what is often their first encounter with a real Palestinian narrative, and with a real Palestinian relationship. So we do a lot of work with youth. We do a lot of work with young adults. I would say in the West Bank, one little piece I might add to what you said is that you don't, as a Palestinian, I don't think you need to learn to hate Jews or to hate Israel. Of course, there's disinformation and there's propaganda, and I'm sure many of you are familiar to some extent with the state of Palestinian textbooks and the demonization that is present in them and the ahistoricity that is present in them. But if you're a Palestinian growing up under occupation, you don't need to learn to hate Israel or Jews. It's a part of your daily existence. It's the reason you've never been to the beach. It's the reason you have to wake up at 4 a.m. because you have to wait in the checkpoint for 3 hours. It's the reason you haven't seen certain family members who are in Israeli military prison or jail and may have been for months without a trial. There are many reasons. It is hard to live as a Palestinian under occupation and not feel something negative. So I would say it is coming from the educational system and from the political system in Palestine, and it's also coming from the lived experience.
And is that true of the Israeli children? Is it visceral? Is it endemic to their lives as well? And how so?
Yeah. Great question. I would say it is visceral. I wouldn't make a comparison. And as a progressive, I never enjoy, sort of oppression comparisons. So I don't want to get into that. But the fear that Israelis have for Palestinians and that Israelis and settlements have for Palestinians is undeniably real and visceral and something that they have. There's a great story I like to share about Rabbi Hanan Schlesinger, who's our international director. And he talks about the first time he went to visit and meet with a Palestinian. And he said to his wife, I'm going to this village, I'm going to whatever the name of the village was. And she said, I've never heard of it. And he said, well, neither have I, but apparently it's only a 10-minute walk from the village we live in, which we've lived in for 20 years. And they had lived such separate lives from Palestinians. They didn't know the name of the Palestinian village. That was a 10-minute walk from where they've lived for 20 years. And she begged him, his wife begged him, don't go. It's not safe. I might not see you again. It's not worth the risk. Begged him. And he went. And one of the first conversations he has is with a Palestinian. And the Palestinian says, it's the first time I've ever met an Israeli, and I'm scared. And Hanan said, you're scared?
Yeah.
You don't get to be scared. I'm scared. And the guy said, you're scared? You're the ones who carry the guns. And Hanan said, well, we only carry the guns because we're afraid of you. And it's this like crazy aha moment where they had really never understood the fear of the other. In a way, this cycle. So that fear is real, right? Hanan carries a gun on his hip because he's afraid that Palestinians want to kill him and his children. So the fear is real for both peoples. The lack of humanization is real for both peoples. But I would say the suffering and injustice that a Palestinian is facing in the West Bank is leaps and bounds different and more extreme, of course, than the experience of an Israeli living on a settlement. But sure, the emotions and the fear are both, I would say, valid and visceral.
What would happen if that story were told all across Israel in schools? I'm just curious. I mean, if I had a child and, 8 years old, we've got so much service here with things that are taught in school that parents don't want their kids, like our critical race theory. This would go along with that. And school districts all over the country are canceling this, quote, cancel culture. It goes both ways. I'd just be curious. That's a very powerful story. And if let's say 6 to 10-year-olds heard that story, I'm just curious what would happen. Would a school, well, you don't have districts in Israel, but would schools allow that?
Your guess would be as good as mine.
So as a follow-up to Ruthie's question, and something that you tossed off as kind of an offhand comment, we've been engaged one way or another with Yad B'Yad. And why wouldn't that be a natural partnership for the work that you do, where they are starting in kindergarten, pre-kindergarten in Gan, and going all the way through, 12th grade, and where it becomes, an opportunity for not only the students to be together, but for their families to be together as well. And it's not a panacea, and there's still lots of difficulties that they don't try and gloss over. They just, Yom Ha'atzmaut is a big problem in these schools. And it's an opportunity, and they do have these mediated sessions with the students as they get older, where they can talk about these issues. So is there something about their mission that differs tremendously from yours that doesn't allow for that partnership, or is there a partnership?
There's an organization you could take a look at called the Alliance for Middle East Peace, which is a sort of trade association for the reconciliation and people-to-people organizations working in Israel-Palestine. And there's more than 100. Yeah. It's an incredibly underfunded space. If you were to compare it to the Northern Ireland conflict, approximately $33 per person per capita per year was spent on people-to-people work to help resolve the Northern Ireland conflict. So $33 per person per year spent on people-to-people work. This was a bill that was co-led through a bipartisan leadership, through Speaker Tip O'Neill, and if we were to take that and compare it to what we're investing in Israel-Palestine, you would think we're spending even more than that, because this is the biggest conflict in the world. I mean, in the eyes of any media outlet, right? This is the most talked about, the most resourced, the most funded, the most present conflict on the planet. And 1/10 is spent on people-to-people work, around $3.30 per person per year. 1/10 of what was spent in Northern Ireland. So I say there's more than 100 people-to-people organizations, and I like to say that and also emphasize that it is an incredibly underfunded space. And anyone who says, peace or a reconciliation to the conflict isn't possible is wrong. We've just been investing all of our money in all of the wrong places. It's not going to come through a US negotiated deal. It could come from that, but it will come from having people on the ground who are providing political capital and support to making concessions, taking risks, and building peace and some sort of solution. And that will only come through the work that is happening by many organizations. Roots is one of them, with a particular focus in a particular region with a particular demographic. Yad B'Yad is another one with its own particulars. I used to run missions to Israel-Palestine where I would bring faith leaders, rabbis, and ministers from across the country to study conflict and reconciliation. We visited Yad B'Yad on every single trip. Yad B'Yad, I think, is an awesome organization, and I love the work that they do. I think there's something like, 6 or 10 of those schools across Israel, and there needs to be hundreds. And frankly, I think every school should teach Arabic, and every school in Israel could probably learn a lot from the Yad B'Yad curriculum. But we're just doing different work, right? It would be interesting to see how that kind of school could exist in the West Bank, but I'm not sure how it could. Because right now there's very, very few areas in the West Bank where Israelis and Palestinians can even come together. Yeah. And of course, Palestinians in the West Bank aren't citizens of Israel, so they're not going to an Israeli educational system. So I think there's clear challenges with the work that we do in terms of partnering with many organizations, because we're one of the only ones who works over the Green Line. We're one of the only, or if not the only one, that explicitly organizes folks living in settlements. So I think there's sort of mission differences, vision overlap, but I wouldn't know what it would look like for us to partner in a deep way. But I would also leave that to my team on the ground. I'm not one of the professionals, so I leave that kind of.
So you mentioned the dollars that are spent on people-to-people work. Does the government of Israel, is there any budget for this work that comes from the government itself?
In roundabout ways, I want to say yes. There is not, as far as I'm familiar with, a fund to really support this work at the federal level in Israel. So the United States recently did pass the Nita Lowey Fund for Peace, which is a part of a multilateral international fund to fund these efforts. It's the first of its kind for this Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and it passed a year or two ago. There's also through USAID something called the Conflict Mitigation and Mediation Grant Program, which for years was putting $10 million a year into this work. They now upped it to 12. The Nita Lowey Fund should put up to 50 million a year into this, with the hopes that another 200 million a year will come from other governments around the world. So there is global funding for this. I do not believe there's much Israeli governmental funding for it. And frankly, I see this work not only as peace building toward a future solution, but as ongoing de-radicalization and de-escalation work that saves Israeli and Palestinian lives. And if I had an opportunity, and when I do have opportunities to sit down with Israeli ministers, Israeli cabinet members, is folks in the Knesset, and I did this just a month ago in a meeting I had with the second ever Arab member of the cabinet for regional affairs, and said to him, as I say every time I have this opportunity, this is about Israel's national security. You can tell all of the right-wing parties, you tell all of those on the left, or excuse me, all of those on the right, every Palestinian who goes through one of these programs, in very blunt terms, is one less risk of a person committing violence against Jews. And every Israeli that goes through this program is a little more dignity, empathy, freedom, livelihood for Palestinians. If every soldier, even if we can end the conflict tomorrow, if every Israeli soldier saw Palestinians as humans and truly treated them as such, we would be dealing with a very different dynamic in this conflict, with a very different risk assessment, right? And if every Palestinian truly was going through these programs and had those relationships with Jews, we would see a lot less attacks. So I actually see this as national security work. I would love to see funds that are being used in military defense and other avenues. I would love to see this funded not just through a moral eye or a how do we solve the conflict eye, but the understanding that there is proactive community building work that we can do to prevent violence and de-escalate rather than just responding to it with military force.
I have a question.
Go ahead. There's somebody online also, Rachel.
Okay.
When you'll give the next question. I can't see who was asking.
Zach, it's Ken Lorch. I commend your message and your vision, the two Zionisms. I think that's a very inspirational and insightful vision. So kudos to you. Could you elaborate a little bit more on precisely what it is that you do to communicate that message, not the Zionism message per se, but the message of reconciliation when you go into one of those communities versus the other, Palestine or settler, and just how are you accomplishing this?
Yeah, so I will speak very humbly. I am not accomplishing much. I am the president of Roots, which is to say I'm the chairman of the board. I live in Brooklyn. This work is happening on the ground in Israel, Palestine, and there are incredible Israeli and Palestinian grassroots leaders who are doing all of this work. And I get to talk about it and help fundraise for it and, take credit for it in events like this. But I visit infrequently, and I'm really not doing a lot of that work. It is individual Israelis and individual Palestinians within their communities trying to do this work. And it often starts with just that conversation. I had a meeting with an Israeli settler, with a Palestinian, and then whoever they're speaking with in their community, who's and ahs and looks and is shocked and asks if it's safe and doesn't understand and thinks you're crazy and why would you meet with the enemy? And then you're kind of like the nut job who does that. And then finally you convince them to come to an iftar meal or to a coffee or to a text study or to this or to that. Or you learn that there were Israeli settlers who were helping Palestinians pick olives to protect them from other settlers who were trying to do violence against them, or you learn about a mosque that burns down, and you learn that their Jewish settler community came to raise money and try to help rebuild the mosque, or you hear that an Israeli was killed by a Palestinian terrorist, and that Palestinian who are part of the organization came to the mourning tent to mourn with the family and let them know how sorry they are. And maybe that's what convinces you to show up for the first time. But it's really through those personal and individual conversations. There are organizations, like I said, like the Alliance for Middle East Peace and other organizations that are working on, higher level lobbying across the world and in Israel, Palestine, and who are trying to direct resources and political capital and funds toward this work. But it is really people within their own communities engaging one another.
Okay, question. First of all, I'm strongly Zionistic. I went to Zionism camps and all this, and I was born the same year as Israel got its independence, so it was always a big deal. And my question is, you've explained so many organizations, Israeli organizations, Jewish organizations, working towards peace and understanding with the Palestinians. What kind of organizations are backing Palestinians for the same purpose of mediation? That through what I've seen, it seems like they stand alone. They don't have the backing of other Arab countries, Jordan, any of them. In fact, they don't even want them. So that's my question. How much organization do they have working towards the same things that Israel is working towards for coexistence or for peace?
Okay, I wasn't sure what that noise was. I will say many of the organizations that I've named are actually not what I would call Israeli organizations. They are co-led Israeli-Palestinian organizations. So Roots, our full name is really Roots Shurashim Judor in English, Arabic, and Hebrew. We have a Palestinian and an Israeli co-director. Many of these peace organizations are co-led by an Israeli and a Palestinian, by a Muslim and a Jewish co-director who share responsibility and who are doing that work together. So I would not call Roots an Israeli-led organization. I would call it an Israeli-Palestinian co-led organization. An organization like Yad B'Yad, I don't actually know what their leadership structure is or who is in charge. So I would sort of add that piece of clarification. And I would say, like, in terms of most of the funding for this work is coming from the American Jewish community. It's coming from the American government. It's coming from other governments and grant-making bodies around the world. Historically speaking, there has not been much Arab, Palestinian, or Muslim infrastructure toward Israeli-Palestinian peace, nor has that been a large funding priority, explicitly that kind of people-to-people work. And there are many valid reasons for that. A primary concern is this idea of normalization, this idea that this is an abnormal situation. There are clear power dynamics. You are bringing, for example, criticism of Roots that we will hear is that you are bringing settlers, the people in power, the people in control, into conversations with Palestinians who lack freedom of movement and freedom of transportation, who are confined to a geographic area and unable or virtually unable to leave, who lack economic security, right? Who lack even just autonomy over when they're allowed to go outside sometimes or where they're allowed to go because of Israeli enforced curfews, right? By a government that they don't vote for, and an Israeli enforced blockades where they may just shut down a city and say, you can't go anywhere, right? They're facing economic anxiety and insecurity in every way, right? A Palestinian in the West Bank truly lacks power. So you're bringing someone who has a lot of power in material and other ways with someone who has very little power and saying, let's have a conversation. right? And one of those people is holding a gun even, and the other one's not. So it's really, really hard for many Palestinians to want to go into a situation where they feel like there is this power dynamic, and that there's a fear that you can't just have these conversations. Like, it really makes the oppressor feel good to engage with the oppressed and to be able to apologize or feel contrite or, be in community with them. But that doesn't change the state of oppression. A Palestinian will go to a meeting with an Israeli for shared hummus, and it will take them 2.5 hours to get there because of checkpoints, while it takes the Israeli 20 minutes to get there from the same area and is wondering why the Palestinian is late. And then they get there, right? And it takes the Palestinian the other 3 hours to get back. And he goes back home to lacking rights and agency and power and freedoms. And the Israeli goes on with his life. And the Palestinian will do that a bunch of times and say, so what's the point of this? I'm just making you feel better. Nothing's changing for me. So that's a real concern, a real lived experience for many Palestinians. And I think for many Palestinians, for many Arabs, for many Muslims, when they look at this conflict, there's a concern that people to people work is simply normalization. It's a way to normalize the status quo and the conflict. Personally, I think that is a risk. I don't think that that is an inevitability. I think that is a cautionary tale that we need to be aware of. Dialogue is not a means to an end. Excuse me, dialogue is a means to an end. It's not an end in itself. So if you're just having dialogue and you're not trying to transform the status quo, then I could understand why that would be normalization. I would understand why that would be harmful. And if you're not recognizing the power imbalances, I could understand why that's normalization. The way I like to refer to our work is abnormalization, because we're taking Israelis who don't see the situation, who don't see Palestinians as human, who don't understand how their lifestyle in the West Bank, in Judea and Samaria, is impacting Palestinians. And we're trying to tell them this situation that you think is normal, because your life is normal as a settler, is not normal. And we're trying to sort of abnormalize the conflict in that sense. So to sort of just bring it back to the question very clearly, many of the organizations are co-led. Much of the funding is still coming from the global community, from non-Arab or non-Muslim or non-Middle Eastern sources. On the ground, there's still, in good peace organizations, a clear attempt to be co-led, to recognize these power imbalances and to create that agency. And there's still a lot of work to be done in the broader Arab world, I think, to bring light to this kind of work.
Can I ask something that's, I think, tangential to that? It strikes me that you and I could have the same conversation 20 years from now, and 30 years from now, and 100 years from now, that working one-on-one, doing it. I've been a believer that the long-term solution is probably based more on Ari Shavit's concept, something that along the line, which was basically investment in the West Bank, because you're never going to get, there is no way for a Palestinian government or an Israeli government to sign a document and to reach a treaty, just for the same reason we don't get anything done in this country. You can't come out and for that, and it's political, if not personal, suicide. So what is the effort being made to go beyond the let's have a meeting tomorrow over hummus and get to how do we get people to invest in production, in building factories, in building schools, so that those Palestinian and Israeli kids can go to school together and not just have a meeting over lunch, so that they can work side by side and not just take that 2 hours or a 20-minute walk to see each other once. I think you'll be having these 20-minute meeting walks for the rest of your life, unless it's an expanded thing, and you have to get, for that, investment from other places to build those facilities to really expand the concept.
Yeah. So it's a complicated answer, because first of all, are we talking about in the West Bank or in Israel proper? Right? You mentioned shared schools. Shared schools aren't going to happen in the West Bank because there's different they're different countries, right? They're in different schooling systems. They have different municipalities. Like they're not citizens of Israel. So how do you even pay for a non-citizen of Israel in the West Bank in Jenin to go to school with a? So there's some really complicated answers, and there's really not an answer, let's say, for a lot of those questions in the West Bank. I believe a two-state solution is possible. I believe what I would call a 2+ state solution is possible, some sort of confederacy model, 2-state, 1 homeland, two sovereign states, some sort of porous borders and EU style bilateral relationship. So I still believe that's possible. I believe that's possible because I'm youthful and naive. And I believe that's possible because the data spells out, actually, that depending on when the questions are asked, we can actually get a majority, or at least in the worst of times, a plurality of people on both sides, Israelis and Palestinians, to agree to the end of the conflict. There's some amazing data that comes out from Khalil Shakaki, who's a Palestinian based in Ramallah, who I've been privileged to meet probably a dozen times. Where he asks these kinds of questions in very interesting ways that actually inverses how we imagine people feel about the conflict. So he would say to a group of Palestinians, do you support a 2-state solution? And they, 70% would say no. And he would say, well, let me define a 2-state solution. Would you support X, Y, Z? And all of a sudden a plurality or majority would say yes. Right. He would say to the Palestinians, will you ever end the conflict without a right of return? And they would, a 70% say no. And he would ask the Israelis, would you ever end the conflict if it meant a Palestinian right of return? And 70% say no. So then people like to go on CNN and say, right, there's an irreconcilable claim. There's no way the conflict will end. So then Khalil Shakaki comes in and he says to the Palestinians, would you accept an end of the conflict if the right of return was recognized, Israel recognized that you have a right to return. They paid $20 billion, let's make up a number, in reparations as a part of that recognition. And they allow 100,000 Palestinians to return to Israel and get Israeli citizenship. So they recognize the right of return. There is reparations. There's some number of Palestinians that are allowed to return. And then, of course, there's a Palestinian state where the others can return to. And all of a sudden, a plurality or majority, depending on when the question is asked, of Palestinians say, yes, I would accept that. You ask the same question to Israelis when you define those terms, and 70% say I would not ever allow a right of return. But close to that many will also say, if that's what a right of return is, then I'll allow it. Yeah, that I would be okay with. So I think for real reasons and not just Pollyannish reasons, I'm actually confident that people on the ground believe in a shared outcome to what this conflict could look like. The real challenge is there's a lack of trust. And this is where 80% of Israelis and Palestinians, when polled, believe that the other side, when given the chance, wants to kill them, and believes that the other side is not going to end their claim on the conflict, which is to say, any peace deal that is signed is their attempt at getting more. So in the future, they can start from a new negotiating point and try to get even more. i.e., I don't think these people actually want to share the land or split the land. I think they want it all, and I think they'll never stop. Those are trust issues. Those are communication issues. And that's where I think that this people-to-people work is so important, because the challenge is not actually irreconcilable claims. The challenge is a lack of communication and trust, an inability to trust the other side, to actually stick by their word, to mean what they say, to implement an agreement that you both may already agree to, but you simply don't trust the other side to engage in it in good faith. So those are reasons why I actually believe that this kind of work can create the social infrastructure, the political capital for a real concession to be made. It has been happening for some time in some way. An organization like Roots was founded in 2015. We're very new. Most of these organizations came out the Second Intifada. And again, we're investing about 10% of what we were in the Northern Ireland conflict, not equal, not 10 times, but 1/10. So I'm not someone who would say for certain this is the strategy and that this will work, but I would say this is an untested strategy. It is essentially an unfunded strategy, and it is actually still quite a new strategy that has data and political theory and history to back it up. So I think it is possible. I think it's very possible. And it's also true that we could have the same conversation in 10 or 20 or 30 years. And if in 10 years you come back to me, Jerry, and you say, Zach, we're funding it as much as we funded the Northern Ireland conflict, we did everything you asked and nothing's changed, I might say, you know what, maybe I was wrong. But I think it's something that is actually, we just don't know yet. And there's enough reason to start investing in it.
I might suggest, if I can, that one element I think you omitted there is the same thing we're going through in this country, say around abortion rights. And that is 70% of the people believe women should have a choice on their bodies. And yet we have governments who for their own political reasons would never sign that kind of a bill, would never agree to that. And you've got the same thing in Israel and the Palestinian government, because they know that signing that document, it may be that 70% believe that there should be a two-state solution, but tell me who in the government would be willing to sign their name on that document. Yeah. And I don't know of anybody, and especially when you have two different governments on the Palestinian side. Yeah. How does that happen? And that to me is where the difficulty arises then of that solution. It's not just, and they're able to stoke fears on their side of it then.
Right. There's a gap between the political infrastructure and the people. And one of the things I love so much about Roots is that we're working with the spoilers to the conflict, the radicals, the ideologues, right? It's not a peace rally in Tel Aviv. It is religious, ideological Zionist settlers who are living on the land that they think God gave them, saying Palestinians are human, Palestinians deserve rights, Palestinians deserve equality, the status quo is terrible, and we need to make concessions and changes. And I think the power of that is if you can actually reach the radicals with that message, the people who are preventing the conflict from being resolved, that's where I see some of the most powerful possibilities for change.
Thank you.
Thank you.
One last thought.
I'm just going to tell you one quick story, if I can, at the end. That is, I was one of the last times, well, that's 20 years ago, when I was in Israel. My daughter lives in Pardes Hana, by the way, and so we get the regular updates. But we wanted to go to Bethlehem. It was on Christmas Eve. And my son was living in Israel for the year, and he had worn a yarmulke. We decided we're going to hide the mezuzot. We're not going to speak Hebrew. He's going to wear a baseball cap. We're just going to blend in. And we were supposed to meet our cab driver to go back at a gift shop and walk in. We could take a tour with a Palestinian gentleman giving us a tour of the church. We go back to the gift shop and walk in, again, nothing showing that identifies us as Jewish. And an Arab gentleman's behind the counter. He stands up and turns to us and says, "Shalom, can I show you a menorah?" And you realize at that moment that he just wants to make a living. He could care less who the guy is coming in the door. He just, we're okay, and just come on over here. If you want to buy something from me, great.
Yeah.
Just the last thought. I have two very good friends in the Chabad. In fact, one I lived and saw his children grow up from 3 years, and now he has 11 children. Have you spoken to the Orthodox or the ultra-Orthodox, your thoughts about what's going on and how their participation, so to speak, can maybe help the situation? Following up on that, if you would, I could introduce you at some level to these two friends of mine and arrange for maybe you might talk to the group I mean, there are so many Chabad within the area itself. It might be helpful. So that's my comment and thought and question.
I am grateful for that. I am always looking, and our team is always looking to have these conversations. Most of our folks on the ground are Orthodox Jews, right? They have beards and wear tzitzit and live in the kinds of settlements you would expect them to live in, and are shomer everything, and identify in that way. There's a big gap, of course, which is those are the folks who are doing the work on the ground, and then we might run a speaking tour in America, and we'll speak at almost exclusively Reform and Conservative synagogue. Even though it's an Orthodox rabbi who's on the speaking tour, the Orthodox rabbi has a hard time getting into Orthodox shuls. So we tend to never be able to get into mosques, and we tend to never be able to rarely get into Orthodox shuls. And we have an opportunity to do that, of course, because our speakers, our people are Orthodox Jews. So they speak the language much, much better than I imagine, most of you would, because these are Orthodox rabbis who live this life. So I think that's a tremendous opportunity. It's one that we're very aware of, and it's one that we should be taking more advantage of. Frankly speaking, the speaking tours that we run and the meetings that we have in the States are primarily fundraising focused. So there is a tension between wanting to, let's say, do that work to influence and shape the American Orthodox community versus needing to do work to fundraise to make the work possible on the ground in the region. So if I only have my Orthodox rabbi, Hanan Schlesinger, on the ground in America for 2 weeks, and we have 10 Reform synagogues saying we'll pay a $3,000 honorarium for you and your Palestinian partner to come speak here, that's $30,000 that goes directly to the work we're doing on the ground to pay for our staff and fund our site. And if we could get 10 Orthodox synagogues to say, we'll pay you the $3,000 and we want this, I would just as happily go to those Orthodox synagogues, as well or instead. But there still needs to be a lot of work for them to want to invest in this. And we're not an organization that exists to shape, American Jewish opinion or Orthodox culture. We're an organization that exists in America to raise money for the work that's happening over there. So there is like a tension there, but I think we have a lot of opportunity, and we actually did just receive a grant from an individual who grew up Orthodox, who saw that we could deeply influence the American Orthodox community. And I said to him, Matthew, you're right, but we just can't afford to, because when we're here, we need to be raising money. But if you want to give us a bunch of money, then maybe we can come here and take a pause from fundraising and meet with some Orthodox leaders. So he said, well, here's a bunch of money. And I said, all right, we're going to come back for a couple of weeks and meet with some Orthodox leaders.
Okay.
So we want to do it. We're open to it. And those are some of those challenges.
Okay.
Right. Zachary, I want to thank you. I want to give you, Zachary's going to be meeting with our 9th and 10th grade students in about 25 minutes. So I want to give him a break, and so he can come back at 11 o'clock to meet with them. But thank you very much. I truly appreciate your involvement. And we'll see you in a few minutes. I guess.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I give you strength.
Well done.
Thank you all. Just threw my email in the chat in case anyone would like to stay in touch.
Okay.
Great to meet you all.
Thanks.
Was this
Yeah, and I-
material that we were supposed to get
What's,
at this presentation, some material about what he's doing?
I can give you his email. I can get it.
Well, that would be helpful, but I was under the impression
Website
there
is
was
really
some
very.
material that we could have, but I misunderstood that, perhaps.
Yeah, give me your email and I'll be glad to get it to you.
Fine.
When I was in Bethlehem like 10 years ago visiting, or more than 10 years ago, I was so surprised.